All right, chapter 6. Why did God command the Sabbath to be observed? We're covering chapter 6 of Stick-Stone Sabbaths and Sundays, seeing the Sabbath in light of the new covenant. To understand God's command to keep the Sabbath days, one must understand why God gave it in the first place. As we look to Scripture for our answer, we find that the Sabbath command was given to Israel for two reasons. We see that in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Both reasons are part of what is commonly known as the Ten Commandments. We will start with Deuteronomy 5 and then get to Exodus chapter 20. So there in Deuteronomy 5, we see the commandments are given in very short, concise statements, right? If you think of the Ten Commandments right now off the top of your head, you're going to come up with some very short statements that probably come up. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not commit adultery. However, the fourth commandment, to observe the Sabbath day, comes with a paragraph underneath it. There's lots of explanation. Why is this? And that's one thing we're going to be looking at today, is because they needed reason for its establishment, because it was not a commonly known thing. It was new information. The other commands needed no explanation because the activity which they forbade was commonly known to be sinful. However, observing the Sabbath was not normative to humanity, Moses, or the Israelites. We find no record of it anywhere in Scripture before this. The fourth commandment needed further explanation because it was a new command connected to the recent freedom from slavery that God had accomplished for Israel. Therefore, God did not just say, observe the Sabbath, and stop there, like do not commit adultery, or do not steal, or do not kill, or do not bear false witness. Instead, he has to give an explanation. So here we see this explanation in Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. And here comes the explanation. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And then the explanation that no one anywhere in their group, visitor, animals, servants, etc., children, no one is to do work on that day. Why? Well, because they were to rest and remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Wow. So this is the reason they were commanded to keep the Sabbath day. So why was the Sabbath day commanded? It was commanded for the Israelites to recall, remember, to think on God, to think of his mighty works that he had accomplished on their behalf while they did nothing. They had no weapons. The Egyptians had everything, the richest nation in the world, but yet they were set free, right? And they were to rest and recall and remember those times. Ezekiel 20, verse 12 through 14, gives us a great reason for the Sabbath to be established. God says, moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them. Same thing we find over in Exodus 31, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. And my Sabbath they greatly profaned. Then I said I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to make a full end of them. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. So again, in this passage, God explicitly states who he gave the Sabbaths to and why. From this passage, we can see that Israel was the only nation that God commanded to obey the Sabbath, and it was in conjunction with what God did for them, and it was a sign of the covenant that God made with them, and that's why they were to obey the Sabbath. God had separated them out. He had sanctified them. He had called them to a holy purpose to serve him. And this was a sign. They were all supposed to rest on this day. Deuteronomy 7, verse 6 through 11, very similarly states this, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people, that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping that oath that he swore to your fathers. The Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him, but by destroying them. He will not be slack with those who hate him. He will repay him to his face. You therefore be careful to do the commandment and statutes and the rules that I command you today. So from this passage, we see that God sanctified, separated Israel out for his use, for his purpose, from all of the other nations, and that the sign of this covenant was to be the Sabbath. Now, God had not covenanted with any other nation. Therefore, not every nation was required to honor, obey the Sabbath. We find this in Exodus 31, verse 14 through 17, where God over and over says, it's to you, to you, to you. And who is the you he's referring to? It is Israel. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel, very important, shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So from this passage, it can be clearly seen that who is to obey the Sabbath? It is Israel. Why are they to obey it? Because it's a sign of the covenant, of what God has done for them, and it's analogous that God rested from the creation. After 6 days, he rested, and they are to do so as well. Now, sadly, covenant theologians often use this passage to attempt to prove that keeping the Sabbath day has been a command of God since creation. And we covered this earlier, but we'd like to cover it again here. In fact, in Exodus 20, this is another reason for keeping the Sabbath. But as we discovered earlier, this does not mean that it was not a command that every person was to rest on the seventh day, because God rested on the seventh day. He does tell this to Israel. It is a covenant for them. They're to remember the Lord their God and what God has done for them. But this passage does not say anything about the Sabbath day being a command since the creation of the world for all mankind. Instead, God commands only Israel to follow the same pattern of work and rest that he did at creation. And even if we look back again at that Genesis 2, 1 through 3, we don't see anything about that. God rested, but there is not a command for anyone else to do so, given to mankind. In quick summary, so why did, if we look back at the beginning here, why did God command the Sabbath to be observed? In quick summary, why did God do this? It is important to consider when God commanded the Sabbath to be observed and whom God commanded to observe it. Then and only then can we really begin to see the reason behind such a command. As we have seen, there is no mention of anyone ever keeping or breaking the Sabbath command in the book of Genesis, because God had not given it. It was not until God made a covenant with Israel that he commanded the Sabbath to be observed. God had chosen Israel and set them apart for his holy use. Likewise, he commanded them to set apart the seventh day as a type of visual aid, a sign of the covenant that God had made with them. Now, with these passages in mind, are Christians required to keep the seventh day Sabbath? Think about that for a moment. Are Christians required to keep the seventh day Sabbath? And again, we must let Scripture speak for itself and not add and not subtract from it. God explicitly gave the seventh day, the Sabbath day, to the nation of Israel as the sign of the Mosaic covenant. Christians are not the nation of Israel, nor are we under the Mosaic covenant. That covenant was for a specific people, for a specific time, and that goes for the sign of that covenant as well. We'll continue to explore this and what it means for us in the new covenant in the next chapters.